Hi, I would like to discuss the silences regarding um, non-heterosexual or non-binary female sexuality in um, Iranian history or literature culture. Um, Research on Iranian female same-sex relation is also arguably scant. Beginning from pre-modern era within the Islamicate world, there has been an absence of women authored writing on the topic of female sexuality. Of course, this is not surprising because, as I have discussed in my other lectures as well, usually the writing sphere is a very male dominated sphere. So um, it was um, it was usually men writing about women, and they weren't writing as much about um, non-heterosexual women. In the Arab world, a few scholars have highlighted this absence also, trying to discuss, female same-sex desire using primary literary sources. In her book, Female Homosexuality in the Middle East, Histories and Representations, for example, Habib traces the roots of female homosexuality in Arabic literature and scholarship to the 9th century. And she delineates the ways that discourses on female homosexuality were replaced with religious orthodoxy, which in turn considered diversity of sexuality as deviant in medieval period. Now, similarly, discussing this void in the Arab medieval world, Sahar Amer points to the existence of homosexual activity between women within numerous instances of quote unquote eroticized gender bending in Arabic literature. Some examples of this gender bending includes Sufi tales of slave girls cross-dressing as male cupbearers, or masculine pronouns used to refer to the female beloved in courtly lyrics. According to Almer, these examples are evidence of, quote, the unrecognized spaces where expressions of homoeroticism in the medieval Arabic tradition may well have occurred, end quote. Now, these unrecognized spaces also exist in Persian culture, society, literature, and scholarship, as do social silences concerning these spaces' existence. In Iran, a few scholars have contributed most to this discourse, such as Afsan Najmabadi, Janet Afari, Nikki Kedi, Catherine Babayan, who have done great work and scholarship in this field, trying to um, both explore and demonstrate these silences and absences. These scholars have highlighted the absence of scholarship on the female body and sexuality in pre-modern Iran within a body of writing authored by male philosophers, historians, or clerics. While imagery and symbolism of cross-dressing female cupbearers and the use of the gender-neutral pronouns are prevalent in Persian pre-modern Sufi poetry, the majority of Sufi scholarship has focused on male homoeroticism, regardless of the fact that female same-sex relationships and sisterhood bonds or Khohar Khandegi also existed in Sufi and female saints' shrines, much like the bonds of brotherhood among men. Such research indicates that the desire and the urge to be connected with the same-sex beloved, even under the cover of Khohar Khandegi, led many women to religious rituals and venues where they could network and expand homosocial friendships. While visiting these female saints' shrines, women developed these bonds of sisterhood that often included homoerotic relations too. However, many women felt the need to enter heterosexual marriages at the same time due to sociocultural pressures, or even after and during a loveless marriage, illustrating that the era's dominant values on female sexuality and morality often coerced women to abandon their female companions. But this type of regulation of female sexuality does not mean that female homoeroticism was non existent. In fact, Iranian women found various ways to circumvent this dominant constraining discourse. In many cases, after the marriage of the female beloved, for instance, one of the women followed the other one as a handmaid, helping her along the way and staying close to her female sweetheart, even during the most intimate circumstances of her heterosexual marital life. Research based on the Qajar princesses' harem memoirs shows that same-sex female bonds and relationships continue to be prevalent even during the Qajar era, and women who engaged in same-sex relations in harems were called musahaqin. While examples of these female same-sex relations are scant, the very few that have recovered testify to the existence of such relationships and are proof of strong desire embedded in the dominant society's efforts to suppress and silence women's voices in the name of morality. After the Qajar dynasty fell, female same-sex relations continued to exist during the Pahlavi era, albeit on the sidelines. According to Janet Afari, and I'm quoting, in the all-girls high schools, close intimate relations with lesbian dimensions were also common. They wrote letters to one another, exchanged gifts, and became inseparable. End quotes. End quote. In girls' schools, students who shared close romantic bonds were called baruni. Families would warn their daughters against these barunis, while these female homoerotic relations often existed even after women entered heterosexual relationships, the female female desire and relationships remained, albeit underground, socially regarded as a result of poor upbringing or inborn abnormalities. After the Islamic Revolution, in spite of all the conservative gender reforms, a gay and lesbian underground subculture flourished in Iran's major cities, in the capital city of Tehran and in diaspora. The Iranian Queer Organization, with headquarters in Toronto, Canada, was founded in 2004 under the name Persian Gay and Lesbian Organization. At the same time, e-magazines began operating and publishing online articles um, inside Iran with the help and the support of the activists in diaspora. Around the same time, discourses around gender confirmation, surgery, and hormonal treatment became prevalent with the aim to heteronormalize sexual deviance. These discourses arose due to views among Iranian medical and legal leaders who believed that, as Afsaneh Najmabadi details, quote, sex change is framed explicitly as the cure for a diseased abnormality, that is, gender identity disorder, end quote. While these organizations are either underground within Iran operating within Toronto or Europe, or non-operative after a while, the Islamic Republic publicized the idea of heterosexuality as a phenomena imported from the West. Now, today, I want to talk about an activist, a poet, who basically, by writing poetry, by her poetry, portrays the ways that this silence can be broken. So I want to talk about Sagi Qahraman and her poetry. Born in Mashhad, Iran, Qahraman lives in exile in Canada currently. An Iranian poet in diaspora affiliated with PEN Canada, Qahraman founded and operated the Exiled Writers Club, which over the course of 2 years allowed exiled writers to discuss poetry and fiction and perform readings of their own work. After 2 successful years, Qahraman passed the leadership of the group to PEN's outreach officer. In a 2007 interview with Boswell of CanWest News, Qahraman stated, and I'm quoting, "Sexual boundaries must be flexible. The immoral is imposed by culture on the body," end quote. I had a conversation with Qahraman, and when I talked with her um, about the poetry and activism Z does, Z expressed that Z locates discrimination against her as a non-binary, gender non-conforming individual in the context of important social silences concerning Iranian sexual fluidity. Qahraman's first collection of hearing about same-sex relations among women was the word baruni, the same word that was used for girls sharing close bonds at schools, when her mother warned her about same-sex attraction on the first day of the first grade when Qahraman was only 6.5 years old. As Qahraman's mother said, quote, "Beware of barunis. Make sure not to use washrooms during school hours. Don't accept flowers and chocolate from older girls. Don't stay alone with any girls in empty classrooms or behind the steps," end quote. Now, this statement highlights the prevalence of public schools' anxieties regarding deviant female same-sex relationships. And following such cautionary statements, individuals like Qahraman, who had a sense of having a non-normative sexual and gender identity, suffered from the lack of resources to help them to understand their feelings and their self later in their adolescence and youth. The contestation of sociopolitically, religiously, and culturally imposed boundaries on the body is precisely what Qahraman does in her writing. As he expresses, I'm quoting, "In the Western countries, writing is a profession, a career. But for Iranian exiles in Canada, writing is our identity. If we don't write, it's like we don't exist at all. We have the responsibility to write," end quote. At the same time, Qahraman has been running the Iranian queer organization since 2008 and has funded Gilgameshan Books, which publishes exclusively LGBTQ literary works. Today, Qahraman identifies as bisexual and, I'm quoting here, "interested not in the same sex, but the neutral state of gender in the individual," end quote. Now, while many Iranian youth have increasingly been using the cyberspace as a mechanism to express their sexual and gender identity both in Iran and in diaspora, Qahraman has used cyberspace to carve a space in her writing where the private and the public meet. a line here to break the silences about non-hetero female sexuality and mobilize activism. Whereas phallocentric cultures draw a line between the public and the private, resulting in the invisibility of non-phallocentric gender and sexual expressions in public spaces, Kahraman disrupts this binary and brings the private and the public together in the public sphere of blogging and writing. Blurring the distinctions between the public and the private cyberspace has enabled expressions of gender and sexuality in general and expressions of non-hetero, non-binary female sexuality for Kahraman. Aiding Iranian queer community to understand their self better, not only has Kahraman been active in Iranian LGBTQ activist movement for a decade through writing and activism, but through poetry, Z has also broken the suffering silence that has squelched the voices of the queer community in Iran. These silences have deprived the queer community of the autonomy to define their own desires, identities, and feelings in public spaces, such as in marriages that, according to Ghahraman, and I'm quoting, cost her a whole lifetime and terrible, painful challenges both for herself and for her family, her parents, and her children, end quote. The price Kahraman paid was a normative marriage, a child, and a consequent divorce, all while dreaming of female sweethearts. Z discusses this forced heterosexual marriage and the child out of this marriage in a poem titled "The Child is 18." In this poem, referring to the coercive nature of heterosexual marriage, Kahraman writes, and I'm reading from the poem. I am 43. The child is 18. I love him so much. Aren't his shoulders astonishing, or the smell of his back? Even though you're sweet, my child, don't you see my throat is sore? There is a wound up here. There is a wound done here. So the image of the painted throat and the wound, and also the wound up here and down here, refer to the effect of the maintaining enforced silence over half a time of quiet suffering. The discrimination and violence that Kahraman has been subjected to have not been physical punishment of the state or imprisonment. Rather, this has been the social silence that has exacerbated a lifelong lack of venues to express herself, causing a, quote, lack of understanding of alternative sexual orientation and gender identities, end quote, not in her personal life, but also in Iranian culture. So to fill this void, this cultural void, and break this silence, Kahraman writes poetry and weblogs that negotiate topics of non-hetero and fluid gender and sexual identity. Z uses cyberspace to respond to mainstream narratives of female desire, producing an alternative outlet to generate a social change challenging institutional structures, upholding the status quo. Kahraman's online representation of self interweaves both textual and verbal content alongside nonverbal visual elements, such as her own nude photographs, effectively solidifying her work from art and into personal realities. Her blogging crosses between private and public experiences and interactions, demarcating a gray area between her private identity and the public audience, conceptualizing what Crampton calls technologies of the self. For Kahraman, the internet is not a space of anonymity to hide her identity. Rather, it becomes the arena where Z defines her identity and reveals unknown layers of herself. As a tool of dissent, Kahraman's poetry on her blog challenges socio-political narratives. As a form for cultural and literary production, it is an alternative genre. A non-phallocentric, female-centric method of reasoning and writing, Kahraman's poetry is open and non-linear. Through analyzing her non-phallocentric, multi-layered, and non-linear poetry, Kahraman practices agency and becomes a subject who controls her own choices. In fact, in writing, Kahraman writes herself. By telling women's and non-binary subjects stories and writing the self, not only does Kahraman assert herself and her desire, but she also liberates others who have been subjected to historical silencing and suppression of their voices. By rewriting this androcentric history through poetry within the public sphere of cyberspace, Kahraman pushes back against the attempts to mute queer sexuality and desire within Iranian culture. Kahraman gives voice to historically unthinkable and unspeakable issues of veiled Iranian women's bodies and voices, breaking the deafening silences concerning the multiplicity of gender identities and sexualities. In her poetry, branding heterosexual non-compliance as deviant, Kahraman illustrates how society enforces heterosexuality. In the West, heterosexuality has been historically espoused as normative since the advent of the terms heterosexuality and homosexuality in the 19th century. Western sexological discourses that utilized racial otherness alongside sexuality to frame non-heterosexuals as deviant. A similar process has also taken place in Iran in the first half of 20th century. Since heterosexuality has been framed as normative in modern Iran, especially after the 1979 Islamic Revolution and the act of defying the heterosexist cultural and political institutions, often becomes a form of political resistance, Kahraman's poetry can be viewed as a political act and an example of queer rights activism. Kahraman's poetry demonstrates that heterosexuality is neither inborn nor chosen by the individual, but rather it is a product of sociocultural and political norms forced upon the individuals by social institutions. In opposition to this forced heterosexuality, Kahraman promotes choice, the ability to choose one's sexuality freely. Kahraman's writings move beyond proscribed cultural narratives and attempts to give voice to those voices silenced as non-normative, incapable of conforming to restrictive sexuality and gender schemas. Kahraman informs us of boundaries imposed on the bodies and minds of marginalized populations by misogynistic, racist, colonialist, and heterosexist institutions in her poetry. Imagery that focuses on traversing gendered and sexual borders is important to Kahraman's poetic world, serving as a witness to her struggles and other non-conforming individuals surrounding identity. Her choice of blogging is a means of disrupting the conventional understanding of what constitutes literature. Kahraman's writing highlights points of queerness, marginality, and alterity in canonical Persian literature. By transgressing the sociocultural borders demarcating conventional and non-conventional sexuality imposed on the body, and by extension on Persian literature via canonical versus non-canonical literature, Not only does Qahraman attempt to understand and express her own self, but Z also endeavors to bear witness to the experiences of marginalized populations, that is, Iranian queer communities, and give voice to those whose historical and contemporary voices have been censored in Iran. It is within this silenced context that Qahraman locates her voice, bearing witness to the experiences of those who have been muted. Via activism, blogging, poetry, Qahraman advocates for the stifled voices and experiences of the marginalized Iranian non-heterosexual and non-binary populations. Bearing witness signifies that the witness has been present for a past incident or experience. That is, witnessing a past presence. Having been present to invaluable experiences, Qahraman bears the burden of bearing witness to what is presently represented to here in memory. So in a way, through writing, I'm quoting, memory itself is remembered. Memory becomes the canvas on which Qahraman represents what Z has witnessed. It is therefore important to study Qahraman's writings, or writings such as Qahraman's, to see how queer writing and weblogging responds and reacts to dominant silences around Iranian women's same-sex relations. In a poem titled Ta'amul, translated as interaction, Qahraman emphasizes the importance of choice. 28 out of 38 lines of the poem begin with the word choose, which is in and of itself indicative of Qahraman's advocacy for choice and a critique of lack thereof, overusing the word itself as if to break the deafening silence. One needs to keep repeating the word itself. Z advocates for the idea that each person should be able to choose to do what they want with their body and sexuality. In writing, Qahraman sporadically uses dashes or leaves multiple spaces between words. These grammatical manipulations emphasize what has been silenced and unexpressed by dominant heteropatriarchal narratives, forcing the reader to pause, initiating moments of contemplation. It is as if Qahraman asks the reader to distance themselves from conventional narratives, accepting a new non-normative narrative of sexual and gender identity. Such spacing is present in all Qahraman's writings. For instance, in a poem titled Cross-Dressers, Qahraman focuses on a male cross-dresser wearing a purple gown and sandals, who claims that his genitals are stolen by the narrator. The narrator expresses a desire for the cross-dresser to smile, but the cross-dresser will not. Several times throughout the poem, Qahraman writes, and I'm quoting, "How strange, everything is upside down." A comment on the socially perceived deviance of the relationship, that is, it's upside down. The cross-dresser is referred to by his name, and that is Shahpur, referred to a reference to Shahpur Shahidi, a well-known actor artist. The narrator declares that, quote, "Shahpur is an infant born thousands of years ago. Why was our eye purple when he saw me?" End quote. This statement can be interpreted as Qahraman's confirmation that queer individuals, signified by the color purple here probably, cross-dressing and same-sex desire have deep historical roots born thousands of years ago. The reference to Shapur is also intentional on Qahraman's part to bring many layers of private into the public space, a public figure's private life as a testimony to the private lives of the queer community in the public space of the internet. Qahraman writes, and I'm quoting from the poem here, "We did nothing during the night. Crying, yelling, shouting, whining was all we did. We used the night for a stage, a crazy one. The curtain rise, the curtain fall, rise, fall, rise, fall, rise, fall, 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 stupid." The falling and rising of the curtain can be felt from the constriction of the words and phrases on the page, and it is highlighted by the poem's visual composition via its use of spacing. As the reader progresses through the poem, the phrases transition from lyrical to constricted. During the initial instances of the phrases, for example, the curtain rise and the curtain fall, Qahraman utilizes a larger space on the page, which is later repeatedly truncated. Of additional significance here is the use of the word curtain, which can be interpreted as veil or hymen according to Persian idiomatic connotations. The curtain / veil / hymen also refers to what Afari describes as the semi-covert dar parde, homosexual and bisexual sexual interactions within heterosexual marriages. This ingenious use of the word curtain hints at the silences surrounding Iranian discourses of sexuality and that coerce the queer folk into heterosexual marriages, which may include same-sex extramarital activity for some individuals. Since poetry is a rhythmic and meter-based genre, a medium such as onomatopoeia is of utmost significance. While typically onomatopic words are monosyllabic to emphasize a particular point or evoke some sort of emotion, Qahramans are polysyllabic. Z uses onomatopic sounds and words in the poem titled "The Fifth of the Month." The title refers to the time of the month the narrator expects their period, which has a strong impact on a woman's feelings and moods and increases their desire for sexual and erotic engagements. So this is a line that Qahraman uses. Laye, 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 pahayash ke. Here, Qahraman refers to the speaker's lovemaking with her female lover. Onomatopoeia becomes the figurative device that Qahraman uses here to convey intimacy and sensuality between women. As the partners engage in their sexual act, they joyfully indulge and chuckle. However, each time they sense gratification, the speaker reminds the reader that there is no reason for laughter. And I'm quoting, "Why are we chuckling?" This is indicative of a sense of shame and guilt for engaging in an act perceived to be devious. The last sentence of the poem again invokes Shapur, whom the speaker looks for as if seeking for a justification. In both the fifth of the month and the cross-dresser I discussed before, Qahraman's narrator expresses a strong urge to not hide their partner, which can be a reference to the underground nature of same-sex relations in Iran and Qahraman's critique of socioculturally imposed silences on non-binary individuals. So language and cyberspace are the most critical tools for deconstruction and rewriting here. Phallocentric discourses have been defined as linear and exclusive, that is, male writing requires a strictly hierarchical organization of sexual difference, which has traditionally benefited men. In contrast, Qahraman's writing functions as a revision of these previous historical and cultural understandings of language. Here, writing is conjunctive, nonlinear, inclusive, and multi-layered, serving as a response to the historical exclusion of non-conforming and non-binary subjectivities. Here, writing reveals that these binary values are social constructs that conform to and reify the norms of heterosexist societies. The desires and relationships present in Qahraman's poetry challenge this patriarchal heteronormative framework, decentering these relationships typically exalted as ideal within heteronormative social schema. By doing so, Qahraman gives voice to historically excluded and marginalized queer members of the society.